That prayer. Good to see everybody tonight, and again, feel comfortable and free to join in our discussion. We're going to be in Acts 17. We got down to about verse 16 last week or week before, I guess, 2 weeks ago, and I want to review just a little bit since it's been a couple of weeks. Paul and Silas are on their second missionary journey, and when we got to the end of chapter 16, we find Paul at Philippi, and just a brief reminder of where we are. You got Philippi up here in the province of Macedonia, and they went through Amphipolis and Apollonia, to Thessalonica, then Berea. And then from Berea, they went down to Athens. And that's kind of where we find him tonight at this particular point. Just a brief summation of what happened in these areas. Of course, Philippi was the place where the Philippian jailer was converted, and Lydia and her household find Paul being put in prison there at Philippi. It's where he converted the Philippian jailer. And then also Lydia and her household. After they were beaten severely and tortured, they left and went to Berea, or went through Thessalonica, I should say first. And that's found in the first 4 or 5 verses of chapter 17. It says, when they left, after converting Lydia and her household, they had seen the brethren, they comforted them, departed. They passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, came to Thessalonica. There was a synagogue there, and as Paul's manner was, he went in the synagogue on the Sabbath days and reasoned with them for 3 Sabbath days. He had some good results there. There were some of the Jews that believed and obeyed the gospel. There in verse 4, and consorted with or were with Paul and Silas in what they were teaching. But there seemed to be more Greeks or Gentiles. It says a great multitude, also the chief women, not a few. So there was a very big group of conversions there. Seemed to be mostly Greeks. So the church there in Thessalonica was mainly a Greek or Gentile church, even though there were Jews there as well. As a result of that, Paul had to leave, verse 5, he had to leave because there were some of the Jews who seemed to be in the majority that did not believe what he was teaching. They moved with envy. They got some others, very wicked people together, assaulted the house of Jason. Evidently they had moved Paul and Silas from there. I don't know whether they had some type of warning, but they got them out of there and sent them to Berea. So then it says those in Berea, there in verse 11, were more noble or more attuned to listen to what Paul had to say than those in Thessalonica. They received the word, verse 11, with all readiness of mind, searched the scriptures daily whether those things were so or not. So they gave heed to what Paul was saying. They looked at the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures that he was teaching from, of course. And it says even the honorable or noble women, which were Greeks, and of men not a few. So there were a number of conversions there in Berea. We don't read of a church actually being established, or it's not mentioned later on. But there may have been one there because of the converts that were made there. But the Jews in Thessalonica weren't happy. There in verse 13, that they had heard what was going on in Berea, that the word of God was preached Paul at Berea. They came to Berea, stirred up the people, created an uproar, and Paul had to leave again. We don't know exactly which way he went, whether by sea or by land, it doesn't really matter. But he left Timothy and Silas there in Berea. We're going to pick them up later on in Athens, but he left them there to continue the work. They were after Paul mainly, so they kind of stole Paul away At that point, in verse 15, they conducted Paul, brought him to Athens, and receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timotheus for to come to him with all speed, and they departed. The interesting thing there, and looking up two or three of the commentators, it doesn't mention, there's no mention of actually Silas and Timothy greeting him or getting to Athens for him. He was waiting. We're going to talk about that in just a second. He was waiting for him. There's not any indication that they got there. Some think that maybe they did. Some think that they didn't, because when he gets to Corinth, he mentions that when he wrote back to the church at Thessalonica, which again was still on his second missionary journey after he left Athens, went to Corinth, and we'll pick that up in Acts 18. So when he was there for a year and a half at Corinth, evidently he wrote back to the church at Thessalonica, and there's a reference, and find it real quick. I think it's 1 Thessalonians 3. Because a little bit confusing. Not that it matters. A little bit confusing of whether Silas and Timothy joined him in Athens or at Corinth. In 1 Thessalonians 3 and verse 1, wherefore, when we could no longer forbear, we thought it good to be left at Athens alone, and sent Timothy, our brother and minister of God and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and to comfort you concerning your faith. It seems there, the way that's phrased, that maybe Timothy was there with him at Athens, and he sent him back to the church at Thessalonica to strengthen them, to build them up, and so forth. Some of the authors think that since there's no mention made in Acts 17 about that maybe he didn't get there, that he was still at Berea, because, let's see, there's another, let's see if I can find it. Well, I can't find it right now, but let's see. Because when he's writing back, Paul and Silvanus and Timothy to the church of Thessalonians and so forth, he writes that letter, and some think that since the letter was written from Corinth, in all likelihood, even though there are some say that it might have been written from Athens, but most Bible scholars say from Corinth, that maybe that was maybe they didn't make it to Athens, but joined him at Corinth. It doesn't really matter, but it could be one or the other. But at any rate, that's a little bit of the history there. So we get to verses 16 to 18. Any thoughts before we continue on? Anybody? I want to get to his speech here in just a little bit of what he was, the main purpose of him getting to Athens. But in verse 15. We just mentioned that he sent for Silas and Timothy, who were at Berea, to come to him with all speed. So now he's at Athens himself. They were left back at Berea to strengthen the brethren and so forth that had been converted. And it says in verse 16, it seemed like he was going to wait for them, but look at the way it's expressed. Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. So here's a man that didn't waste any time. He was waiting for them. They hadn't come at the time that maybe he thought they were going to be there and so forth. At any rate, at whatever point that was, it says, verse 17, therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews. Of course, that was his mode of operation. If he found a synagogue there, that's where he met the people, met the Jews, to teach them about the gospel of Christ through the Old Testament scriptures. He disputed with the Jews and with the devout persons, evidently some of the Greeks, doesn't mention that, but evidently the Gentiles or the Greeks, and in the market daily with them that met with him. So let me just read a couple comments from B.W. Johnson, where he says that that the city was wholly given to idolatry. When you look at that expression, wholly given to idolatry, B.W. Johnson had a comment about that, and he said, and Wayne Jackson has a little bit more, but he said that there were more idols in the city of Athens than in all of Greece combined. There's the way B.W. Johnson mentions it. And let me just read just something just real quick from Wayne Jackson. He was talking about, he said, the streets were cluttered with some 30,000 sculptures of Greek gods, though the population was only about 10,000. So we had a population in Paul's day of about 10,000, had 30,000 statues and idols and so forth to the various gods all throughout the city. So when Paul came into the city, he saw all of it, of course, saw all the idols and so forth, and that's when he began his oration about the idols and so forth, and then talking about the unknown God that he's going to get to here in just a minute. So they were wholly given to idolatry, full of idols, and Johnson says that this is confirmed by the Greek writers, and he mentions a Greek historian, Pausanias, Pausanias, again says that there were more idols in Athens than in the rest of Greece combined. So this is one of their own writers that mentioned how many there were. So, and he said many other writers bear the same testimony. So he disputed with them in the marketplace, a public square, and this was evidently where he went to the hill, the Mars Hill. It was called the Areopagus, if I can pronounce that right. And there were two main groups of people there, and I want to mention just a little bit about them because I've kind of misunderstood what the Epicureans, or the belief of the Epicureans. You had the Epicureans and you had the Stoics, and some of you guys that are scholars can enlighten me on this, but let me read just a couple of things about the Epicureans and Stoics. So these were two of the philosophical schools that prevailed in Athens at this particular time, and so Paul disputed with both groups. Both had a different view about things. The Epicureans held that the gods were careless about human affairs and that a man's best course was to get as much pleasure out of life as possible. Now, I've heard, and maybe some of you guys have too, we've heard the expression, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. And I've always thought that applied to the Epicureans. In other words, that was their philosophy. Have y'all heard that or thought that? I've always heard that was the thing, but I want to read a couple of schools of thought that said that was a little bit misleading, a little bit different. So I've learned it a little bit wrong if I've learned it that way, or if it was not that way. It says that the Epicureans held that the gods were careless about human affairs, that the man's best course was to get as much pleasure out of life as possible. With them, the Epicureans, pleasure was the chief good. And I want to come back to that in just a minute. The Stoics were fatalists, believers in a sort of pantheism, and insisted on self-righteousness. Epicurus was the founder, of course, of the Epicureans. Zeno, Z-E-N-O, was the founder of the Stoics. So when they got together, they were saying, what is this babbler going to say? What about these strange gods that he's talking about and so forth? Of course, he was speaking of God and Jesus. So they brought him, and I want to read just something else here in just a minute about those two groups of people, but they brought him to the Areopagus, and that was the Greek term for Mars Hill in verse 22. That was the hill where they had the place of assembly where the Supreme Court of Athens evidently met, that the courts convened to discuss, to take up religious matters and so forth. And as a result, they wanted to hear Paul and what this setter forth of strange gods and so forth, as they said, because their whole thing was to hear or tell some new thing. That was kind of interesting to me. That, of course, you hear about the Greek culture and so forth, and they thought that they were a cut above, that they were a little bit more intellectual, a little bit more elite, maybe that. than others were, and so forth. And of course, so this was kind of in harmony with the spirit of the group. Let's hear what he has to say. We haven't heard this before. We're interested in something that's different, something that's strange, something that's out of the ordinary. So we're going to hear him about this strange God or gods that he's talking about. So they were into either telling or hearing some new thing. Demosthenes, an Athenian orator and statesman who lived in 384 to 322, I believe it was, BC, talked about this as well, that even back in his day, and this was 300 something years before Paul came on the scene, he said that was the nature of the Athenians in the time that he lived in the 300s and so forth. And we'll see that when we look at this Epicureanism. And let me just read just a few things about Epicureanism, if I can have enough light on it to see it. This is a school of philosophy. This is from the I believe it's the Holman's Bible Dictionary that I got this from. A school of philosophy which emerged in Athens about 300 BC. So that was shortly after Demosthenes, his life, but they were already into hearing and telling some new thing at this particular point in time. Epicurus was born in 341 BC on the Greek island of Samos, Samos. His school was called the Garden. This was in Athens, and he gathered people around him and so forth and taught them his philosophy. And of course, this became very well known in Greek culture and also in Roman culture later on. And this is what Paul was confronting in Acts 17 and verse 18. And let me just read what it says about this, because it's a little different from my understanding of Epicureanism. Epicurean philosophy centered on the search for happiness. Pleasure is the beginning and fulfillment of a happy life. Often today, Epicurus' ideas are distorted. So this is the point I wanted to just tell you to clear up, because I always heard it say, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die, because that was the general, and I still think that may be the way that it was. But anyway, a couple of different scholars say a little bit different. Many think he proposed a life of sensual pleasure and gluttony. This concept is far from his philosophy and his own lifestyle. To Epicurus, happiness could only be achieved through tranquility and a life of contemplation. In other words, that's a higher school of thought, I guess. You're thinking about things, you're contemplating things, peaceful tranquility kind of thing. That was the pleasure rather than a sensual kind of pleasure, even though others would see that a little bit different. Go ahead, Israel.
Yes, sir. Buddhism's the same way. It's the same idea, what you just said about that.
Yeah.
Of course, like Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun.
There you go. Yep. Yeah, he nailed it, didn't he?
He did.
And that was 1,000 BC or roughly.
Right.
Absolutely. Good point. So
I think the Bible says somewhere where it talks about eat, drink, and be merry.
1 Corinthians.
there are two.
Tomorrow you shall surely die.
Yeah, there are two references that I found. There may be another one or two, but in 2 Corinthians 15:32, we won't turn to it, but that's just a reference. Eat and drink, for tomorrow you die. 2 Corinthians 15:32, I think it is. And Isaiah 22:13 were two of them that I had found about that. So you have one in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament for sure. There may be another or two there as well. He says the goal of Epicureanism was to acquire a trouble-free state of mind. This may be what you're talking about too, Israel, a little bit about the Buddhist.
That's when their pursuit of nirvana.
Nirvana, yeah.
And there's been several Buddhists, but Buddha, if you will.
Yeah.
Do a lot of meditation.
A lot of meditation, yeah. Yeah. A lot of meditation, contemplation, and so forth. And he said, Their goal was to acquire a trouble-free state of mind, to avoid the pains of the body, and especially mental anguish. In other words, to avoid mental anguish and anxiety and so forth and so on. Epicureans sought seclusion from worldly temptations. Epicurus taught that a man should not become involved in politics or affairs of the state. These activities simply serve to distract one from a life of contemplation. He believed in gods, plural, but he thought they were totally unconcerned with the lives and troubles and affairs of mortals. So that's kind of a brief summation of Epicureanism. And then the Stoics, just mention that real quick. We use the word stoic or stoical today, stoicism today a lot, as it pertains to somebody that's very unemotional or not very excitable. In other words, he's stoic. He doesn't jump up and down, and he scores a touchdown. He doesn't do backflips and so forth and so on. He just, like Barry Sanders, just hands the ball to the official. He's stoic. So a person who endures hardship and adversity with fortitude. To pursue wisdom, one had to hold his passions in check. We use the term a lot to describe one who is unemotional or not very excitable. And this is what Zeno came up with. He's kind of the leader of it. And later Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, let me just mention that real quick, I don't want to dwell on it. But Zeno lived 490 to 430 BC, a Greek philosopher, so this was way back when he came up with it. Seneca was born in 4 BC, which is Usher's date of birth for Christ, so he was born the same year, I guess, that Christ was born. He lived to 65 AD. He was a Roman orator, statesman, philosopher. He was a tutor of Nero, which might not be good because he was implicated in a conspiracy against Nero and forced to commit suicide. And then Marcus Aurelius came in about 175, 180 years later, 214 to 275. He was a Roman emperor from 270 to 275 AD, and so he was the next one that adhered to this philosophy and so forth. So that's kind of a brief summation of those two schools of thought. Any thought on that, anybody?
Stoicism was also a branch of Gnosticism, wasn't it? Because
The doubters
the idea of the knowing ones.
not being able to know anything, for sure.
Well, yeah, no, sir, that's the agnostics, but the
The Gnostics, okay, I got you.
Yes, sir, they were the ones who practiced the idea of dualism. That is, it was forbidding to marry and things like that were done by the Stoics, and so you see that part a lot in the New Testament addressed, a part of the Colossian heresy.
Yeah.
I think the Scythians, I can't remember, were the other side, where they get confused, I believe, with the Epicureans, and they were the other extreme. So, but I think the Stoics were a part of that Gnostic
Okay.
belief. My brother Keith may have, I don't know. If I could be wrong on this, Brother Keith.
I think you're right about that.
And it may be kind of along what Paul told Timothy about the refusing to marry and to do
Yes,
other.
that's exactly
That's some of the same group maybe that you're talking about.
And it led to the monastical movement of Catholicism,
Yeah.
where they had these monasteries and they would pray such long times, because that Gnostic extreme went into the quote church, if you will,
Yeah.
and that was that extreme. And then the other extreme was, no matter how much I sin, it doesn't affect me. So 1 John is really attacking particular belief.
That Gnosticism. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. And then let me just read just 2 or 3 things about Johnson, and then we're going to get on with Paul's speech there in verse 22 to 31. He's got 10 verses there that his speech is stated. Mentioned that what Jackson said, that the streets were cluttered with 30,000 sculptures of Greek gods. Population was 10,000. So Paul taught the Jews in the synagogue, the devout Gentiles, on a daily basis. And so the 2 of the main ones, they're the Stoics and the Epicureans. We talked a little bit about them. So they basically were ridiculing Paul and said, "What is this babbler going to say?" And when he was actually just talking about Jesus and the resurrection, and so evidently they interpreted that as foreign gods, but he was going to address the true and living God here in just a little bit. So he was escorted to the Areopagus, which is where the place where the body of legislators or the courts convened, and so forth. So they were, as we might say, intellectually curious, because that was what they seemed to be all about, especially the elite, that they wanted to know more, and thinking about some new thing and so forth. So they wanted to know more about Paul's strange ideas. So he stood in the midst of them and delivered one of the greatest addresses ever, I think, in the history of the world. Matter of fact, both of the authors I'm using, B.W. Johnson and Wayne Jackson, talked about it being not on the same plane or same level with Christ, of course, but next to Christ. It was one of the great orations, and a short, as far as what's recorded was short, the 10 verses. I don't know if that's all he said, but that's what was recorded for us. So his speech begins, and Johnson said evidently it was abbreviated because you would think that it would have been more. It would have been more than the 10 verses that he said there. But so this is probably the Holy Spirit saw fit to just capsule and state what the main message was. He got his point across in those 10 verses for sure. And Johnson said it's been classified as one of the most famous orations in human history, apart from Christ himself. It may be studied as follows. And let me just read what he says about it. Because when he starts out, and I never, before I started looking at it, I guess when I looked at Johnson and Jackson, let me find what is said about it. The statement that's made in verse 22 in the King James, because sometimes when you read that, and I read the King James, that's the main thing that I've always read and still do. That's what I'm using here too. Where he stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, "You men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you're too superstitious." Now he goes on in to talk about the unknown God, but what most people say, the term we say is you're too superstitious, he uses the term religious, or you are very religious. You are very religious, because I even beheld a God, these 30,000 idols. I even beheld one to the unknown God. So as a result of that, you are very religious. So the word superstitious carries a negative connotation. The word religious, if you told somebody you're very religious, it's kind of a compliment, right? If you said you're too superstitious, you kind of look at that as not really a compliment. So most of the scholars said, if you look at some of the revised, and I didn't look at it, I was just taking their word for it, but if you look at some of the revised Bibles, they say that this is a very brilliant opening maneuver, because he mentions the religious scene that he has just seen, that he just observed in the city, and commended them. He wasn't putting them down. He commended them to the extent that he could by using the term very religious, which Johnson said is kind of an ambiguous term, but it preserved his integrity. It preserved Paul's integrity but it allowed them to view it as a compliment. Does that make sense? I mean, it looks like that's what he's doing, because it's kind of like in all of his letters, or most of his letters, if he started out that he was fixing to correct a problem at a church, how did he start out?
Complimenting him.
Complimenting them. I thank God upon every member of you. In other words, he got their attention by saying, I thank God upon every member of you. Your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world, and so forth and so on. And it seems to be, and I never really looked at it that way until I really started looking at it and delving into it and looking at 2 or 3 different commentaries on it, that evidently that's what he's doing, that they could view it as a compliment, even though he was kind of threading the needle, I guess we might say, to get to the point that he wants to make about this God that you're ignorantly worship. If it had just come out and said that you are ignorantly worshiping this God, how would he have been perceived? Probably been kind of like he was at Thessalonica and Berea. He'd probably run out of town or hauled before the courts there, since he was already there on Mars Hill. So he had to find a way to get their attention to the point that they would listen to him. And it seems to be that's what he was doing there. You may have a different view, but that's what some of the scholars seem to think.
He does say you're ignorantly, but
Yeah,
he's
later on he does.
not ignorant. He's talking about you without knowledge.
Without knowledge. Yeah, absolutely. Good point.
He's talking about what a great speech Paul's about to make here. It reminds you of the speech that Stephen made in his
Yeah.
defense.
Yep.
And Paul heard that.
Yeah, sure did. Yep.
I mean, that was a pretty good,
Absolutely.
good speech.
And that was a long oration there when you look at the 60 verses there at Act 7.
I still think Job, as you say, is the greatest literary work ever known to man.
Yeah,
I mean, in the literary world,
yeah.
the book of Job.
Book of Job, yeah, it is. It's
It's
great.
the first book of the Bible.
Yeah.
And of course, the
Beautiful dialogue all the way through.
complex.
Yeah, very complex. Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yep,
But nothing to take away from anything else
Yeah.
God said anyway.
no doubt, no doubt, absolutely. So here, after he seems to compliment them, he cited an example of their theology where he's talking about the worship of the unknown God, mentioning an altar that he saw in the city, evidently, when he came into the city. Their worship was sincere, but as Lord said, but void of knowledge. In other words, what he's saying is that I perceive that in all things you are very religious, but you don't have the right knowledge about the God that you deem the unknown God. Basically, is what he's saying. He gets around to that point. So he introduced the true God to them, and he said the one that designed the universe, all things therein. Johnson says this: they were neither; these were neither eternal nor self-existent. Talking about their gods. Paul explained that the Creator does not live in a humanly made temple, nor is he dependent upon humanity for his welfare. He is the giver of all things, not the one who needs anything. The whole of humanity is derived from one, contrary to their theory that the Greeks were superior. We talked about that a little bit earlier, that the Greeks were superior to everything, and what he's saying is that Paul's saying he made of one everybody, whether it's Greeks, Jews, everybody of the same race, the whole of humanity. So the whole of humanity is derived from one, not from all of these Greek gods that the Greeks thought that they were superior in. So the true God is the one who's sovereign. He determines the duration of life. He determines the existence of life, the expansion of nations, and so forth and so on. And he's ready and willing, anybody that is willing, to help them. If anybody will search him out by examining the evidence, he says that our very existence depends on him. He's the one that gives life and breath and everything to all. So he's the one that you need to pay attention to. Now, after he mentions that, then he switches to a little bit more of a negative approach. He says that the true deity apart from not these that you worship, but the true deity must not be viewed in terms of gold, silver, or stone carving. So that's when he tells them idolatry is wrong. Let me get to that, Lord, maybe y'all help me find it real quick. Back in verse 29. For as much then, in other words, and he's saying even some of your own poets are saying the same thing. Look at verse 28. So he kind of, again, a little bit of a compliment, or getting them to see that even your own poets, some of them are saying the same thing that I'm saying, basically is what he seems to be saying. We'll go back to verse 27. That they should seek the Lord, if haply they may feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is likened to gold, silver, stone, graven by art and man's device. So, depends on how that's read and how he stated it. You can see that they wouldn't be super offended, probably because of what he's already said earlier. He's declaring to them the unknown God, the one that they are religious about, and they're worshiping him. He said, I'm going to really declare unto you that unknown God that he mentions there in beginning verse 23, and then he delves into it and says all these things about God, the one that made the world, all things therein. He's Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't dwell in temples. He's not worshipped with men's hands. He doesn't need anything. He gives to everybody life and breath and all things and so forth. He's made of one blood all nations, and so forth and so on. So then he goes back to what the Lord was saying when you get down to verse 30, and the times of this ignorance, in other words, your lack of knowledge about the true and living God, that he's not made of gold and silver, by art graven by somebody and so forth and so on, in man's device, that God winked at or God overlooked at some point in time, but now he commandeth all men everywhere to repent. Now, we use that verse a lot when we offer an invitation and so forth and so on. Let me just read just a statement he says here. Let's see. So Johnson says this, Paul then switched to a more negative approach. The true deity must not be viewed in terms of gold, silver, stone carvings. He says idolatry is wrong. God had not demanded full retribution for this great effort. He had exercised much patience. In other words, when he's saying that God overlooked it at some point or God winked at, it was because they didn't have the true, even though they were punished under the old law, they didn't have the true the Messiah on the scene and so forth. So now we have no excuse for it, and these Athenians have no excuse for it, and we have no excuse for it. But under the Old Testament law, you couldn't get forgiveness of sins, be rolled forward a year and so forth. So he's saying, or seems to be saying, that it's different now to the point that you're going to have to repent. It's really important for you to repent. He doesn't go into all the plan of salvation at this point, but he says you must change your way of thinking and your life and to repent, because there's coming a day when he's going to judge the world in righteousness by this same one, basically, that they're ignorantly worshiping, or they don't know anything about the Christ, evidently. So he's saying that God hath ordained this man to talk about the Christ, and the fact that he raised him from the dead gave assurance that this is going to happen. So now it's important for you to change your way of thinking. Go ahead, Israel. I know you have thought that.
Yes, sir. Just back to the idea of the poets is interesting. Some people get confused about inspiration, thinking, well, were those poets inspired? No.
Right.
It is the recording of what the Apostle Paul said.
Right.
He just took their principle, because you can get that in Jude, the book of Jude,
Yep.
and others like the book of Jasher quoted several times.
Yep.
Those things were not inspired, but
Yep.
God's use of them became what God says, and what Paul says here is what's inspired.
Exactly.
But also the other thing I had understood this passage to mean is that everything up until Christ's coming was always God's wrath being withheld until the Christ would come.
Yeah,
And that
That's a good
whether
point.
it's the old law or whether it was the patriarchal age, it was withheld in the times of this ignorant God overlooked. But now,
he held back until the time.
yes,
Yeah.
sir, there's no excuse.
Right.
Because the
Good point.
kinsman redeemer that Job wanted and had petitioned about, rather, was here.
Yeah.
And so, you know,
Absolutely, excellent point, good point. Yeah, that's the term about overlooked, not that there wasn't punishment for sins even under the old law,
right, you definitely want.
but he withheld the what would you say, the final
Well, the wrath
judgment, the
upon
wrath.
mankind by rolling the sin forward and so forth
Yeah.
until the Christ would come.
Yeah, it appeased him for a period of time until Christ came on the scene, and then
Yes, sir.
now he's appointed that day. And that's what he says here, that he's appointed today, the verse 31, in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, and that he hath raised him from the dead. So he gives the assurance that that's going to happen, and the way he gave the assurance is the fact that he raised Christ from the dead, and we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that we're going to stand before God. So some weren't happy with that. Look at verse 32. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. And I think that was, let's see, which one? I'm trying to think, one of these,
Well, these were definitely material.
I think it was the Stoics.
Stoics,
I
yes.
think it was the Stoics. Yeah, I made myself a note of it somewhere. That the Stoics evidently mocked about that because they were kind of aligned with the Sadducees that didn't believe in a resurrection and angel spirits.
The Essenes were big into
Essenes.
Stoicism as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of them mocked, and others said, "We'll hear thee again of this matter." So some of them were not convinced at all. Some said, "Well, we want to hear more about this." So Paul departed from among them. Now he did have some results. He mentions a couple of them and others there in verse 34. Howbeit certain men clave to him and believed, among which was Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So there were some that obeyed the gospel. So Damaris was converted, this lady. Nothing more is known of Dionysius in the New Testament, but Dionysius evidently was, it says an Areopagite, but some type of aristocrat who was converted to Christianity. And Damaris, nothing else is mentioned about her, but it mentioned that she was converted, and others also. So we did have some results there in Athens, even though that's remarkable in itself, the speech, because the whole city was given to idolatry, and he converted some out of that group.
He was a member of the Athenian Supreme Court.
Yeah. That's one of the commentators mentioned that, Lloyd, that he was high up.
All this kind of reminded them there, this is not really the first time you've heard of something like this, because your poets spoke about it.
Spoke about it too, yeah. Yeah, that one that Israel was talking about. Elaine's been reading a lot in the Apocrypha. There was about 7 or 8 books that Bel and the Dragon and
Yeah, that's a weird one.
Tobias and I forget.
First and second, Maccabees.
Maccabees.
Yeah, those are some good.
There's Esther, or what's
Ezra or
Ezra, or something. I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, she's trying to fill in the gaps there in the Maccabean period from Maccabees.
especially first Maccabees, yes.
Yeah, first Maccabees. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Appreciate your good attention and your comments.
Enjoy.